The first time I saw Max, my new neighbor, he was standing in the apartment lobby, scrolling on his phone. He had this air about him, tall, sharp-jawed, unruly black hair that made him look effortlessly cool. There was something magnetic about his presence, a touch of arrogance that was impossible to ignore. My chest tightened as I stared at him longer than I should have. That moment of distraction cost me. The box of toiletries I was carrying slipped from my grip and crashed right into his chest, scattering its contents everywhere. Embarrassed, I scrambled to clean up the mess, apologizing profusely, but Max barely looked at me. His irritation was palpable as he snapped at me to watch where I was going. Flustered, I promised to pay for his suit cleaning, but he dismissed me entirely, returning his attention to his phone like I was invisible. Things didn't improve when I realized Max lived directly across the hall. He made no effort to acknowledge my apologies in the days that followed. One evening, he showed up at my door with the building owner, Mr. Singh, who informed me that my lease was fake. I felt the ground beneath me give way as panic set in. All my savings had gone to a scammer. I had nowhere to go, no one to call. My dream of starting a new life in LA was crumbling before my eyes. Max's frustration was evident, but something in his tone shifted when I started crying. He stood up for me, telling Mr. Singh to leave. Then, in a move that caught me completely off guard, he turned to me and said, "You can stay with me until you find another place." It wasn't charity, I knew that immediately. The look in his eyes said there was something he wanted in return, but I didn't have the luxury to refuse. I packed up my few belongings and followed Max into his apartment. It was sleek, modern, and meticulously designed, an architect's dream. Models of buildings and blueprints were scattered around, telling me more about Max than he ever had with words. He led me to a room that looked lived in, neatly made bed, a few personal items. When I asked whose room it was, he simply leaned close, his breath brushing my neck as he whispered, about the condition I mentioned earlier. Dread churned in my stomach as I braced myself. "What's the condition?" His response made my pulse race for all the wrong reasons. "You'll sleep in the same bed as me." For a moment I thought he was joking, but his steady gaze said otherwise. Alarm bells went off in my head. I considered walking away, but desperation held me back. It wasn't like I had options. "Fine," I said, the word escaping before I fully processed what agreeing to his condition might mean. The first night was awkward. Max was a heavy sleeper, his arms slung over my waist like a vice grip. I lay stiff as a board, convinced I'd made a terrible mistake. By morning, he hadn't let go, his breath soft and steady against my neck. A part of me found it oddly comforting, though I refused to admit it. Over the next few days, I began to notice cracks in Max's aloof demeanor. He didn't just tolerate my presence, he helped me. He brought me to his office and got me an internship at Laurent Designs, the architecture firm he owned. It was the kind of opportunity one could only dream of. At first, I thought it was just a way to keep me occupied, but he genuinely cared about my progress, recording explanations for complex designs so I could learn faster. Despite his kindness, I couldn't shake the feeling that Max wanted something more. His eyes lingered on me too long, his touch too deliberate. One night, as I sorted through project files at the office, I accidentally stumbled across a box on his desk. Inside was a ring I'd lost 2 years ago during an architecture conference. The memory hit me like a freight train. I'd been trapped in a conference room overnight with a stranger, a man who comforted me through my claustrophobia, twirling that same ring around my finger to calm me. We'd talked all night about architecture, dreams, life. By morning, I'd felt like I'd found a kindred spirit, only for him to vanish before I woke up. And now, here it was, the ring from that night, sitting in Max's office. When I confronted Max, his expression told me everything before he even spoke. "I was that guy," he admitted softly. "I didn't recognize you at first, but when I saw you crying at the apartment, I remembered." My heart was a mix of emotions: relief, anger, confusion. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't know if it mattered to you as much as it did to me, he replied, his voice breaking. That night, it was the first time in years I felt at peace. I've struggled with insomnia my whole life. But with you, I slept. I didn't know how to respond. Was that all I was to him? A cure for his sleepless nights? The thought stung more than I cared to admit. Max's confession stayed with me, unraveling in my thoughts like a thread I couldn't stop pulling. I tried to shake it off, but the weight of his words lingered, filling every quiet moment we shared. The tension between us was suffocating. He gave me space after that night, retreating into himself, and though it was what I thought I wanted, it only left me feeling lonelier. Our routine continued, but it felt hollow now. He no longer teased me in the mornings or hovered when I worked late into the night. He avoided eye contact at home and barely touched me in bed. For someone who had once clung to me so tightly in his sleep, the absence of his warmth was jarring. It left a void that made the nights feel colder. I spent my days at the office drowning in work, trying to distract myself. Francine's sharp eyes often followed me, her knowing smirks cutting through my concentration. She didn't say much, but her occasional comments about how much Max had changed since I arrived only added to the storm in my head. I didn't know what to believe. Was I really someone important to Max, or just a temporary bandage for his old wounds? The doubt gnawed at me. It wasn't just about whether I mattered to him, it was about whether I wanted to matter. I wasn't ready to admit it yet, but Max's quiet care, his moments of tenderness, had crept under my skin. Even when I tried to convince myself that his motives weren't genuine, the thought of walking away felt unbearable. The trip to Santa Barbara was supposed to be a distraction, but it only amplified my confusion. The hotel room we shared was beautiful, spacious, yet it felt too small with the weight of everything unsaid between us. Max kept himself busy with his conference preparations, and I spent most of the time pretending to be absorbed in my phone or staring out the window. Still, I couldn't ignore the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. His eyes held something I couldn't quite name, something that stirred both hope and fear in me. By the second morning, the tension boiled over. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, that I didn't care about the growing distance between us. My thoughts raced, tangled with memories of his confession and the way he had shielded me from Mr. Singh that first day. I thought about the night I found the ring in his office and the quiet vulnerability in his voice when he admitted he remembered me. I thought about the way he looked at me as though I held answers he desperately needed. That morning, as sunlight spilled through the hotel windows, I made a decision. I couldn't live in limbo any longer, caught between wanting to stay and fearing I didn't belong. I had to confront what was happening, even if it meant breaking the fragile balance we had. The truth came tumbling out in a rush, like a dam bursting. I told him everything, my doubts, my fears, my confusion. I spoke about how much his actions had affected me, how I didn't know if I was just a convenience to him or something more. It felt like ripping off a bandage, exposing every raw nerve. Max didn't say much. Instead, his expression softened, a quiet vulnerability settling over him that mirrored my own. The space between us felt charged, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions. For a moment, I thought he might retreat again, pulling further away as he had so many times before. But then something shifted. He didn't use words to respond. Instead, he reached for my hand, his touch tentative but firm, as though grounding himself in the connection. His fingers intertwined with mine, and for the first time in days, I felt the warmth I had been missing. It wasn't just physical, it was an unspoken promise, a silent acknowledgement of everything I needed to hear but hadn't yet been able to say. That night, lying in bed beside him, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: clarity. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and the road ahead still felt uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. Max wasn't just keeping me around because he needed someone to help him sleep. He needed me, and for reasons I couldn't yet explain, I realized I needed him too. The shift in our dynamic was subtle but profound. Max didn't flood me with declarations or grand gestures. Instead, he showed me through small actions that he cared. The space between us began to fill with warmth again, not the overwhelming intensity of before, but something quieter, steadier. I stayed by his side, though the arrangement felt more like a choice now than a necessity. We returned to LA to our strange, shared routine. Max no longer avoided me, but he also didn't push. It was as though he was waiting for me to catch up, to decide what I wanted without pressure. I didn't expect it to happen so naturally, but somewhere along the way, I stopped questioning his intentions. Instead, I began to focus on what we had, on the moments we shared, like late-night conversations about design theories, or the way he brewed me tea when I worked late, always without a word. These quiet gestures spoke louder than anything else. Eventually, I completed my internship at Laurent Designs, but I refused Max's offer to help me move on to a bigger firm. I wanted to stay, not just for the job but for the life we had built together. True to his promise, he got me my own apartment in the building, though it quickly became clear I'd rarely be sleeping there. Our bond wasn't perfect. It was messy and unconventional, built on a foundation of unusual circumstances. But it was ours and it worked. Max's insomnia eased, and I found a home I hadn't even realized I was searching for. Some call it fate, others might say it was coincidence. But whatever it was, it brought us together. And for that, I'm grateful. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content like this.